At dawn, the fog was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The Aleutian Islands had their own kind of silence. Not peaceful, but heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The sea was calm, gulls circled above the harbor, and the men at Dutch Harbor thought it would be another dull morning of drills and coffee gone cold. Then came the sound. Engines. Low, distant, unfamiliar. At first, no one reacted. The base was used to cargo planes arriving through the fog. But this sound grew sharper, closer, the kind that made your gut twist before your brain caught up. Sergeant William Lee dropped his wrench and looked up. "Those aren't ours," he muttered. A second later, the first bomb fell. It hit the fuel depot, erupting in a roar that tore the sky apart. Fire licked upward through the mist, painting it orange. The air shook. Men stumbled out of barracks half-dressed, clutching helmets, not weapons. One shouted into a field phone. "Enemy aircraft sighted over Dutch Harbor." Repeat, "Enemy aircraft sighted." For a heartbeat, nobody believed it. Japan? Here? Thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor, on U.S. soil? The second wave came before the disbelief faded. Mitsubishi bombers, flying low, their rising sun insignias slicing through the fog. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life. The base erupted into chaos, shouts, sirens, explosions, men diving into trenches that weren't deep enough. Lee grabbed a Browning and fired upward blindly, through smoke and cloud. He couldn't see the enemy, only the flash of metal, then gone. One plane, hit by return fire, spiraled down into the bay, its black plume dissolving into mist. The soldiers cheered, but the victory lasted seconds. Another bomb hit a hospital tent. For hours, the sky was a blur of wings and fire. Civilians in the nearby town of Unalaska hid in cellars as glass shattered and oil tanks burned. The local priest ran toward the docks with a white cloth, not to surrender, to help carry the wounded. When the planes finally retreated north, the silence returned. It wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that follows disbelief. The ground was slick with rain and oil. The smoke drifted out over the gray sea, where whales sometimes surfaced. Today, there were only wrecks. Corporal Jensen wrote in his field diary that evening, "We always thought the war was somewhere else, over the ocean, in the papers. This morning, it came home." Washington, hours later, received the first reports. The word attack felt impossible next to Alaska. One general scoffed, "They wouldn't waste fuel on tundra." But reconnaissance confirmed it. Japanese aircraft had struck U.S. territory. The shock was immediate, but confusion lingered. Why the Aleutians? Why now? What they didn't know yet, what the pilots knew as they turned back toward the north, was that this attack wasn't a distraction. It was an opening. Across the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto had authorized a bold plan: occupy American soil, however remote, and hold it. For the Japanese high command, the Aleutians were not worthless rocks. They were a foothold, a symbol that Japan could reach across the ocean and touch the United States itself. 2 days later, reconnaissance confirmed the unthinkable. Enemy troops had landed on Kiska and Attu, two small islands swallowed by fog and cold. The news barely made the papers. Most editors buried it under headlines about the Battle of Midway, the real war. But for the few hundred men stationed in the Aleutians, this was no sideshow. They had seen the sky burn. They had watched their comrades buried in permafrost. And as the storms rolled back over the black water, the silence of the islands began to change. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was footsteps. A few soldiers swore they saw shadows moving along the cliffs at night. Voices carried on the fog, speaking in a language they didn't understand. Some said it was just the wind. Others knew better. Lee wrote home to his wife, "The cold here doesn't come from the weather. It comes from knowing we're the edge of the map, and the war has finally found us." The next morning, orders arrived from Anchorage: fortify, dig in, and prepare for counterattack. Supplies were limited, morale worse. From the mainland, it looked like a small event, a footnote. But for the men standing knee-deep in frozen mud, watching the horizon disappear again into gray, this was the beginning. They had no idea that over the next year, the Aleutians would become one of the harshest, most forgotten battlefields of World War II, a place where the weather killed more men than the bullets did. And in that fog, the question no one wanted to ask hung heavy in the air. If the war could reach here, where else could it go next? Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. In Washington, they called it a minor threat. For the men freezing in the Aleutians, it was hell. By July 1942, the Japanese flag was flying on two American islands, Attu and Kiska, names few people in the lower 48 could even find on a map. In the halls of power, it sounded insignificant. But for the soldiers sent north, it was like being deployed to the edge of the earth. The first thing they learned was the wind. It never stopped, slicing through wool, skin, and sanity. Tents tore like paper. Boots rotted in mud that froze at night and melted by noon. Men woke up with frost on their blankets, even in June. Sergeant James Clark wrote home, "We haven't seen the sun in weeks. The ground eats our boots. The wind eats our nerves." He wasn't exaggerating. On the island of Adak, the fog was so thick you could lose sight of a man standing 3 feet away. Compass needles spun uselessly. Planes went down without a sound, their wreckage found months later by search crews who were already half-mad from isolation. The Aleutians were the war's cruelest contradiction, a battlefield where the enemy wasn't just Japan. It was the land itself. When the first American troops arrived to prepare for a counterattack, they expected to find an Arctic wasteland. Instead, they found a place that was alive, violently alive. The tundra was a trap, ankle-deep moss that looked like solid ground until it swallowed you whole. The fog rolled in like a living thing, muffling every sound except the wind and the sea. And always, somewhere out in that white silence, there were the Japanese. The men swore they could hear them. Footsteps on rock. A cough carried on the wind. Once, a patrol found cigarette butts still warm in a cave. Another time, they followed footprints that disappeared into nothing, just vanished in the mist. No one knew how many enemy soldiers were out there, or where. Reports from reconnaissance were contradictory. Some said a few hundred. Others claimed thousands. The uncertainty gnawed at them worse than the cold. The U.S. command called the Aleutian Front secondary. Newspapers barely mentioned it. Families back home sent letters asking when their sons would be transferred to the real war. The men didn't answer. They built foxholes out of frozen mud, strung wire that the wind ripped apart by morning, and waited. Every distant rumble might have been thunder or guns. Every shadow might have been a rock or someone watching. When rations ran low, they hunted seabirds. The meat was oily, foul, but it kept them alive. Sickness spread, pneumonia, trench foot, infections from frostbite. Graves appeared on the ridges, marked only by wooden crosses that the wind soon blew away. A young corporal wrote in his diary, found years later, "We are invisible, forgotten. If we die here, the world won't even know where we fell." But the Japanese hadn't forgotten them. From the occupied islands, they sent nightly radio signals, short, taunting bursts in perfect English. "We see you in the fog. Do you see us?" The broadcasts unnerved even the officers. Men began sleeping in shifts, rifles across their chests. Some claimed to see lights moving offshore, maybe fishing boats, maybe something worse. Others started talking to the fog itself. It wasn't just fear. It was the isolation, the sense that the rest of the world had turned away. Meanwhile, in Washington, generals debated whether retaking the Aleutians was worth the cost. The Pacific had bigger prizes: Tarawa, Guadalcanal, the Philippines. Why throw men into the teeth of the Bering Sea for 2 frozen rocks? Because those rocks were American soil. When the reports from Dutch Harbor came in, the dead, the missing, the wrecked planes, the decision was made. The U.S. Army would launch an operation to reclaim the islands. But it wouldn't be easy. The Japanese had fortified every ridge and valley, built tunnels through the cliffs, and planted mines where the grass looked softest. As the plans formed, the first ships carrying men and supplies fought their way north through storms that shredded sails and froze engines. Some never arrived. Those who did came ashore half dead. Their rifles rusted before they'd fired a shot. One lieutenant, upon landing on Adak, reportedly said, "This isn't a front. It's a punishment." But punishment or not, it was theirs now. By late autumn, the Americans were dug in, waiting for the order to advance. The weather turned worse: sleet, snow, winds so fierce they ripped the roofs off barracks. And somewhere, across the narrow stretch of ocean, the Japanese waited too. No one could see the other side, but both knew what was coming. Back home, headlines celebrated victories in the South Pacific. The men in the Aleutians read the papers, then used them to start fires. In one burned corner of a diary found years later, a final note remained legible. We are still here. The fog has taken the sun, the sea has taken our ships. But the ground beneath us, it's still America. And then, in March 1943, the message they'd been waiting for finally arrived. Orders, retake At 2. Every rock, every inch, whatever it costs. They landed in silence, or what passed for it in a world ruled by wind. May 11th, 1943. The beginning of the battle for At 2. The ships had fought through 40-knot gales just to reach the shore. When the landing craft dropped their ramps, the soldiers stepped out into waist-deep water, so cold it felt like knives. Their boots froze before they could climb the beach. No gunfire. No movement. Just fog, thick, endless, and alive. Some thought the island was empty. Others knew better. Captain Paul Carr shouted for his men to spread out. The beach seemed abandoned, but the cliffs loomed like shadows in the mist. And then, from somewhere unseen, came the first shot. It echoed once, twice, then the hillside erupted. "They're up there," someone yelled. What followed was chaos. The Japanese had spent months turning At 2's ridges into a fortress. Trenches wound through snowdrifts. Machine guns were buried in the hills. Every step the Americans took brought them under fire from above, a rain of bullets they couldn't see. Private Joe DeSoto wrote in his field notes, "We couldn't tell where the enemy ended and the mountain began. Men vanished into the fog. Some froze in place, unable to find their units. Others fired blindly at sounds, and sometimes at their own. A group from the 17th Infantry was wiped out when a grenade landed between two platoons lost in the haze. The weather was the real enemy. It changed by the hour, snow, then sleet, then fog again. Rifles jammed with ice. Medical kits froze shut. Wounded men were carried on stretchers made from tent poles because real ones had sunk in the mud. By the fifth day, the island itself seemed to fight back. The Japanese defenders, about 2,500 of them, fought with a silence that unnerved everyone. They attacked in short bursts, then disappeared into caves. They left behind nothing but empty foxholes and dead bodies half buried in snow. At night, the fog glowed faintly from tracer fire. The sound of engines echoed from nowhere. Once, an entire platoon swore they heard singing, a Japanese soldier humming a lullaby through the storm. The Americans were winning ground by inches, not miles. Commanders tried to coordinate through radio, but static swallowed every order. Sometimes the only signal they could send was a flare, a streak of red in the gray sky. On May 17th, after nearly a week of fighting, they captured a ridge the soldiers nicknamed Bloody Bluff. The cost, 200 men. The reward, another mountain in front of them. One night, a medic knelt beside a dying corporal who whispered, "Tell them it wasn't the bullets. It was the cold." By the end of May, both sides were running out of everything: food, ammunition, even sanity. The Japanese commander, Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki, refused surrender. He told his men, "You will die for the emperor, but you will not die until you take one more with you." The final attack came at dawn on May 29th. It began with a sound like thunder, thousands of boots hitting frozen ground at once. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers, many without rifles, charged down the valley in the largest banzai assault of the Pacific War. Some carried bayonets, others knives, others nothing at all. They screamed as they ran, a wall of human fury crashing against the American lines. The first wave broke through. Men fought hand to hand. Rifles turned to clubs, knives to fists. A wounded Japanese soldier pulled the pin on a grenade and threw himself into a trench. Another, bleeding and unarmed, bit an American's hand before being shot. Captain Carr later wrote, "There were no sides, just men killing men until there were no more left to kill." By mid-morning, it was over. The valley was quiet again. Snow fell on bodies tangled together, American and Japanese uniforms indistinguishable beneath the frost. Out of 2,500 Japanese soldiers, fewer than 30 were captured alive. The rest were dead, many by their own hand. The Americans had lost over 500, with more than 1,000 wounded, and nearly 2,000 evacuated with frostbite or exposure. Sergeant Clark stood on the ridge that night, staring at the white expanse below. "We took back the island," he said, "but it feels like the island took us too." When the news reached Washington, the headlines called it a victory. For the men who survived, it didn't feel like one. They had won America's westernmost battle, a fight no one at home even remembered was happening. And yet, across the gray water, one island still remained under enemy control. Kiska. No one knew what waited there, only that the fog was thicker than ever. Kiska, the last Japanese stronghold on American soil. We take it back, the order read. No one knew the enemy was already gone. It was August 15, 1943. The Aleutian campaign had dragged on for more than a year, and now, at last, the final assault was coming. 35,000 men, American and Canadian troops, loaded into landing craft under a gray, howling sky. The water slapped the hulls like a warning. Visibility, 20 feet, maybe less. The island of Kiska was somewhere ahead, hidden inside the fog that had swallowed every battle in the Aleutians. The men could barely hear their own thoughts over the wind. Stay low, someone yelled, though there was no gunfire yet. They expected it any second. The first boots hit the shore, sinking into volcanic mud. Rifles ready, fingers tight on triggers. Nothing moved, just fog, ocean, and the screech of gulls that sounded too much like screams. Then came the explosions. Shells whistled in from the destroyers offshore, bursting along the ridges. The ground shook. Soldiers shouted warnings, thinking they were under attack. Snipers, someone cried. Incoming. Others returned fire into the mist, bullets vanishing into emptiness. It wasn't the enemy. It was their own barrage echoing off the cliffs. For hours, the men advanced through a landscape that seemed alive. Every rock looked like a man crouching. Every sound, a trap. When a mine went off under a jeep, killing 3 soldiers instantly, panic spread. They're still here, shouted a corporal, his voice cracking. They weren't. Unbeknownst to anyone on the beach, the Japanese garrison had already vanished. 2 weeks earlier, on July 28th, under the cover of a storm, the Imperial Navy had evacuated more than 5,000 men from Kiska without a trace. It was one of the most daring and secret operations of the war, executed so perfectly that American intelligence never knew. But the soldiers landing on Kiska didn't know that. They were fighting ghosts. In the fog, whole platoons became lost. One group mistook another for the enemy and opened fire. Chaos rippled through the ranks. Radio operators screamed for coordinates that didn't exist. Mines, left behind by the Japanese, detonated underfoot. Sergeant Lee, the same man who had survived Dutch Harbor, later wrote, "The island was dead, but it killed us anyway." By the end of the second day, more than 300 Allied soldiers were dead or wounded. Not one from enemy fire. The official report would call it confusion under adverse conditions. The men called it something else, madness. Private Nelson remembered finding a Japanese mess hall, perfectly intact, bowls still on tables, chopsticks laid neatly beside them. The rice had molded. There was a half-written note on the wall, a single kanji scrawled in charcoal, sayonara, goodbye. In another bunker, they found a dog, half-starved, whimpering. A tag around its neck read Baka, stupid. It was the only prisoner taken on Kiska. The fog never lifted. The soldiers dug in anyway, convinced the enemy was still out there. When the wind carried sounds from the cliffs, creaks, echoes, metal hitting rock, they fired again. "We fought shadows," one said, "and they shot back through our fear." By the 4th day, officers began to suspect the truth. Patrols combed every ridge and cave. They found footprints that ended abruptly, piles of trash, burnt fuel cans, but no men. On the 5th day, a radio intercept from Anchorage confirmed it. The Japanese had been gone for weeks. The silence that followed was heavier than any battle. A Canadian sergeant stood in the rain and spat into the mud. "We came all this way to fight ghosts," he said. And the ghosts won. When word reached the mainland, the newspapers called it a triumph. Kiska liberated. As if the enemy had been driven out by force. But the soldiers knew better. There had been no victory, only fog and confusion and the sound of their own guns. Back at camp, the chaplain tried to hold a service for the fallen. The wind tore the pages from his Bible. He stood there, staring into the gray horizon, and said softly, "You can't win when the enemy's already gone." The Aleutian campaign was declared over that week. Officially, success. Unofficially, a wound no one would talk about. The surviving men were shipped back to Alaska or reassigned. Some never spoke of the islands again. Others couldn't stop hearing them. The wind through the cliffs, the echoes of battle that had never really happened. In letters home, they tried to explain what Kiska was like. Most gave up. One wrote simply, "It wasn't war. It was waiting for something that never came." When the fog finally cleared, days after the last troop ship departed, the island stood empty. Craters filled with rainwater, abandoned helmets half buried in moss, the smell of burned diesel and sea salt. And in that silence, the Aleutians exhaled. The war, at least here, was finished. But for the men who'd fought it, against weather, fear, and ghosts, the battle wasn't over. Because some wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when the memory fades. Dear Mom, you won't hear about us in the papers. They say we're just guarding rocks. The letter was dated October 1943, mailed from Adak Island, one of the last outposts left standing after the Aleutian campaign. The battles were over, but the war hadn't gone anywhere. It had just turned quiet. Too quiet. The soldiers stayed, thousands of them, stranded between sea and sky. Their mission was simple: hold the line. Against what? No one really knew anymore. The Japanese were gone. The weather wasn't. Winter came early. It always did here. Snow without pause. Wind that screamed through the cracks of the barracks like a living thing. The men learned to tape the seams of their tents and sleep with their rifles to keep them from freezing. At night, the sound of the gale drowned everything else, even thoughts. They called it the coldest war. The isolation was worse than the cold. Supply ships arrived late or not at all. Letters from home came in bunches, yellowed by weeks of delay, then stopped completely when storms cut the radio lines. You start to wonder, Private Nelson wrote, who's the enemy now? The Japanese? Or the sky? When the sun appeared, maybe once a week, men stood outside in silence, eyes closed, faces tilted toward the light like plants that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Food was thin. Diesel heaters belched fumes that stained the walls black. Men coughed up soot. They burned what they could find, even pieces of old crates, to keep the chill from creeping into their bones. One morning, a blizzard hit so hard it buried an entire mess tent. When the storm cleared, the tent was gone, the ground perfectly smooth, as if it had never existed. That was the kind of magic the Aleutians had. They could erase things. The commanders tried to keep morale alive with Sunday movies and baseball games when weather allowed. But most days the wind made even talking impossible. Men began talking to themselves, to the waves, to ghosts. On Kiska, teams combed through abandoned Japanese bunkers, collecting weapons and notes left behind. In one diary, they found a final entry written in pencil. The fog will take us all, someday. The Americans didn't laugh. They had started to believe it. By 1944, the Aleutian garrisons were ghosts in uniform. The war had moved south, to the jungles, the beaches, the headlines. Italy, Normandy, the Pacific. Those were the real fronts. The Aleutians were a forgotten sentence in a long story. The men read the papers anyway. They saw pictures of parades, of medals, of homecoming crowds. And then they looked out at the gray sea and the empty sky. No one cheered here. Sometimes a ship came through, dropping off new faces, fresh recruits who thought they'd missed the worst of the war. Within a week, they understood. The silence was the worst. The endless waiting. The sense that even victory couldn't find them here. In the spring of 1945, as the rest of the world celebrated the end of Nazi Germany, the Aleutian soldiers were still shoveling snow off the airstrips. They built wooden crosses for those who'd frozen or fallen through ice crevasses. There were no ceremonies, no trumpets. Just a man with numb fingers scratching names into wood. When the news finally came that Japan had surrendered, there was no roar, no gunfire, no flags. A few men stepped outside their huts, stared at the horizon, and said nothing. They'd survived the enemy, but not the silence. The army began shutting down the camps that winter. One by one, outposts disappeared, leaving behind twisted wire and rusted barrels half buried in snow. The tundra reclaimed everything, but not the memories. Years later, a letter surfaced in a collection at the National Archives, written by an anonymous corporal to his mother, but never sent. The ink had bled from moisture, yet most of it was readable. The wind never stops, Mom. It gets inside your head, and you start hearing things, voices that sound like men you used to know. They tell you to go home, but when you turn, there's no one there. He signed it, Your son, somewhere in Alaska. There were hundreds like him. Forgotten veterans of a forgotten front. Men who had faced no glory, no headlines, only cold and silence and the strange knowledge that they had defended America from the shadows. When they finally boarded ships home, many looked back one last time. The islands were invisible in the fog, already fading from sight, as if they'd never been there at all. One soldier whispered, "We leave this place, but I think it stays in us." He was right. The Aleutian War never really ended. It just froze, in memory, in silence, in the minds of men who couldn't forget what it felt like to fight in a place the world refused to remember. And for one of them, forgetting was never an option. He kept a pair of Zeiss binoculars in a cloth bag, the lenses rubbed so thin they looked polished by weather itself. On clear days, rare as a kindness here, he would climb the ridge above the airstrip, kneel behind a slab of rock, and glass the horizon until his eyes watered. Colonel Everett "Rusty" Smith had a face carved by wind and a voice that never rose above the Aleutian gale. One afternoon in late 1944, he lowered the binoculars, pointed with two fingers, and said to the young lieutenant beside him, "You can see them. The islands of Japan, just beyond the fog." The lieutenant saw only haze and distance. Smith did the math out loud, as if reading a ledger. Kiska to Paramusher, about 700 miles. A long throw for a bomber, not impossible. That's how close we are. Not a backwater. A hinge. He wasn't a poet. He wrote like an accountant and walked like a man who expected the ground to move under him. His reports to Navy intelligence were full of distances, wind charts, fuel calculations. But between the lines, if you knew how to read them, was something else, a map of fear. "The Aleutians have taught us," he typed on a Remington that stuck in second gear, "that the continent is porous. The margin between home and war is a weather front." He kept artifacts in a crate under his bunk. A Japanese ration can opened with a bayonet, a prayer strip handwritten in neat kanji, a child's marble, bottle green, found in a Kiska bunker beside a rusted mess tin. He lifted each item like evidence from a trial still in session. "People think oceans protect," he told the chaplain. "They forget oceans connect." Smith had been in uniform since before Pearl Harbor. He knew how quickly certainty failed. In May 43, he'd watched At-2 consume a regiment in snow and fog. In August, he'd watched Kiska kill men with silence. By winter, he had stopped believing the Aleutians were a sideshow. The islands, he wrote, were a telescopic lesson in geography. America touches the world at its edges. Those edges must be held. At night, he walked the perimeter with the sentries, boots crunching on pumice. The wind turned speech into pantomime. He would tap a shoulder, point to the black water, and sketch with a finger the arc of a flight path from the Kuriles to Adak. Most nodded because he outranked them. Some nodded because the cold made any argument pointless. But a few, the boys who had stumbled over empty Japanese foxholes and red diary pages gone velvety with damp, understood. The war was not elsewhere. It was here, breathing with the weather. In February 1945, a reconnaissance liberator went out on a day the barometer lied. It vanished into a snow squall 4 miles offshore. 2 days later, a fisherman found a wing spar washed into the kelp beds, numbers eaten by salt. Smith signed the casualty paperwork himself, knuckles white. "Under cause," he wrote, "operational weather loss," then added a line the form did not require. "Enemy not observed." Later that week, he took the binoculars up the ridge and stayed until the sky went the color of lead. "We lost them to distance," he said quietly. "The same way we almost lost the country, to thinking distance is safety." He testified by cable to a planning board in San Francisco about chains of airfields, radar pickets, and the logic of early warning. He called it seeing far enough to decide early. The phrase stuck. Engineers arrived with crates of strange equipment, oscilloscopes, dish antennas, reels of cable. In the snow, men hammered guy wires for towers that would listen to the sky. "Wind talks first," Smith said. "Machines should too." When V-Day came, he read the bulletin without looking up from his map. "Good," he said. "Now maybe they'll remember the top of the world." On VJ Day, he stood alone on the runway as flares went up half-heartedly and the wind tore their smoke into ribbons. He took the marble from his pocket, turned it in his palm until it caught the pale sun, and put it back. "This is where the next forgetting starts," he told the chaplain later. After victory, people put distance back between themselves and danger. His last Aleutian report ran 12 pages, onion skin fluttering like birds when he stacked them. The conclusion was shorter than a prayer. Keep the edges, or the middle doesn't matter. He shipped out in November, leaving behind a crate of artifacts and a note for his replacement. The weather is the first enemy. The second is amnesia. Years later, a historian would quote him in a book almost no one read. The marginalia from that ridge, the arithmetic of ranges, the inventory of wind, would be absorbed into strategies that shaped the Cold War. Chains of radar, northern routes, the habit of watching from the edge to see the center. But in 1945, all he could do was pack his binoculars, fold his maps, and step onto the gangway. On the last morning, he climbed the ridge one more time. The fog parted in a thin seam where sea met sky. He raised the Zeiss, steadied his hands, and said, not to the lieutenant this time, but to the empty air, I can see them. He meant islands, and he meant years. Below, the engines of the transport ship coughed to life. The wind gusted, then fell. For a breath, the Aleutians were noiseless. A table cleared. He tucked the binoculars away and started down. The ship's whistle blew, a flat, practical sound, and the ridge went blank behind him. The islands did what they always did, covered their tracks. The war for Alaska had not decided the fate of empires. It had decided something smaller and, to him, larger, the way a nation thinks about its borders. And somewhere on the long gray crossing south, with the weather finally to his back, Smith closed his eyes and wondered how long it would take for the rest of America to see what he had seen from a strip of rock at the top of the world. Because the fog was lifting in one place and gathering in another. In the official reports, it was called a minor theater. For the men who fought there, it was the end of the world. When the war ended, the headlines were about Berlin, Hiroshima, Tokyo Bay. The photographs showed crowds dancing in Times Square, confetti falling like snow. But in Alaska, there was only silence, and the long, cold sound of the wind scraping across empty barracks. They came home quietly. No bands, no parades, no medals. Just orders marked completed. Sergeant Tom Richardson stepped off a train in Seattle wearing a parka instead of a dress uniform. The station was full of soldiers returning from Europe, crisp khaki, polished boots, ribbons on their chests. When people on the platform clapped and shouted, "Welcome home, heroes," Richardson smiled, even waved. But when a woman asked where he'd fought, he said, "Alaska," and watched her face fall blank. "Oh," she said. "Cold up there, huh?" He didn't bother explaining. In his pocket, folded and refolded, was a page from his field journal. We came back with frostbite scars, and no one asked where we'd been. Across the country, it was the same story. The men who had fought on Attu, Kiska, Adak, and Amchitka disappeared into the quiet corners of post-war America, logging camps, farms, repair shops. They had lived through blizzards and fog that ate the sky, but the world treated them like they'd been on vacation. The Pentagon's final report on the Aleutian campaign was 12 pages long. One paragraph described the battles as necessary, though of limited strategic importance. Another called them a logistical success under difficult conditions. No mention of the men who froze to death waiting for mail. No mention of the soldiers buried under the wrong flags because the wind had stolen their dog tags. In 1946, Richardson went back to his hometown in Kansas. The town threw a parade for its heroes of the war. They marched behind a brass band, veterans from France, from Italy, from the Pacific. When the announcer reached the end of the list, he added, almost as an afterthought, "and a few boys who served up north." People clapped politely. Then the music drowned them out. One of those boys, Private Nelson, later wrote to a buddy, "We fought on American soil, and were forgotten by it." Some couldn't let it go. In Alaska, a group of officers formed an informal club they called the Fogmen. They met once a year, always in the same bar near Anchorage, where the walls were covered in photographs, ice-encrusted faces, wrecked planes, driftwood crosses. They'd raise a glass and say, "To the ones who vanished," and then they'd drink until memory felt warm again. Others never spoke about it. In 1948, a government surveyor found the remains of a U.S. soldier on Kiska. His rifle was still beside him, rusted into the soil. On his jacket pocket was a letter, unsent, but still legible. Tell them we fought in the fog. Tell them it was real." The surveyor folded it and handed it to his commanding officer. The letter was filed away and forgotten. By the 1950s, the Aleutian Campaign had become a footnote, a curiosity in textbooks, a question on military exams. Even the locals on the mainland began to forget there'd ever been a war so close to home. But for the veterans, the islands never really left them. They could still hear the wind at night, still taste salt in their dreams. They remembered the smell of diesel, the weight of wet wool, the sound of boots sinking into volcanic mud. And they remembered the loneliness, that vast, gray silence where even victory had no echo. In one of his last letters, Richardson wrote to a fellow veteran, "Sometimes I wonder if we imagined it. The fog was so thick, maybe history couldn't find us." He died in 1957. His obituary said simply, "Served in the U.S. Army during World War II." No mention of where. Decades later, his granddaughter found his journal in a box of tools. The last entry read, "They'll remember Europe. They'll remember the Pacific. But no one remembers the place where war touched America itself." She donated the journal to a small museum in Fairbanks, where it sits behind glass. The ink faded, the paper brittle with age. Few visitors stop to read it. But those who do always pause at the last line, underlined twice in blue pencil. The war didn't end for us. It just got quiet. And yet, history has a way of breathing back through silence. Because years later, long after the parade stopped and the soldiers were gone, the fog would lift, and the truth about their war would finally surface. They called it Operation AL, but few outside Tokyo's war rooms ever knew what those two letters meant. For years, Americans believed the Aleutian invasion was just a distraction, a strange, frozen sideshow meant to frighten and confuse. But when Japan's wartime archives were finally opened in the 1950s, the truth surfaced like a wreck from the deep. "We thought they attacked us to humiliate America," one U.S. analyst said. Turns out, they wanted something far greater. The documents were brittle, typed on rice paper, stored in metal cabinets beneath the old Imperial Navy headquarters. Inside were the plans, maps of the North Pacific marked with thin red arrows, each pointing straight toward Alaska. The Aleutian attack, the papers revealed, was never meant to be symbolic. It was strategic, a calculated move to seize the northern skies. A Japanese naval order dated April 1942 read, "Control the northern sky, and you control the Pacific." The plan was bold. While the main fleet prepared to strike Midway, a second force would sweep into the Aleutians, bomb Dutch Harbor, occupy Attu and Kiska, and establish airfields from which Japan could threaten the continental United States. The North Pacific, long dismissed as impassable, would become their shield, and possibly their doorway. In the same binder, American researchers found something even more chilling. A contingency plan titled Operation FS, envisioning long-range attacks from the Aleutians toward Canada's west coast if Midway succeeded. The Empire's eyes were on Alaska not as a diversion, but as an extension of its reach. It almost worked. By splitting its navy, Japan hoped to draw American carriers away from Midway, the real target. And for a moment, the deception succeeded. U.S. intelligence scrambled, unsure whether the main assault would come from the south or the far north. Troops and aircraft were diverted to Alaska, supply convoys rerouted, commanders caught between maps and fear. In Washington, one general called the Aleutians the bait that could break the hook. But the trap failed, not because the plan was weak, but because the men in the fog refused to yield. Those forgotten soldiers of the Aleutians, the ones freezing on mountains and fighting ghosts, had unknowingly defended one of the most vital flanks of the United States. By holding Alaska, they blocked what could have become the first Japanese stronghold in North America. One historian later wrote, "They weren't fighting for rocks. They were fighting for the silence that kept the continent safe." The declassified files stunned even veterans. They realized that every miserable night they'd spent in the wind, every friend lost to frostbite or fog, had mattered in ways no one had told them. In 1953, Life magazine ran a small article titled "The Battle America Forgot," the first major publication to mention Attu and Kiska since the war. It quoted an unnamed officer. "We thought we were an afterthought. Turns out, we were the hinge of the Pacific door." The phrase stuck. Within months, Military analysts began revisiting Aleutian maps, connecting them to the emerging Cold War. Those once forgotten islands suddenly became crucial again, this time as the front line of early warning radar and long-range patrols. The same ground where soldiers once froze in foxholes now hosted antennas and airfields, listening for a new enemy rising from the same fog. The veterans read about it in the papers and felt something shift inside. Pride, maybe, or just the strange satisfaction of being remembered at last. In a radio interview from 1955, Sergeant Tom Richardson's old comrade, Private Nelson, said softly, "We used to think we'd been sent to the edge of nowhere. Now I know, we were guarding the beginning of somewhere." The interviewer asked him if it felt like redemption. Nelson laughed quietly. "No, it just feels like the truth caught up." In the years that followed, historians pieced the fragments together. Operation AL, once dismissed as meaningless, was now understood as part of Japan's grand design, to draw America north, to fracture its Pacific command, to show that even its most remote frontier could bleed. They had underestimated how stubborn that frontier could be. By surviving the cold and the emptiness, the Americans in the Aleutians had done more than defend an outpost. They had preserved the illusion of distance, the belief that the war would never truly reach the mainland. Only now did the irony become clear. They'd fought the first defensive battle for U.S. soil, and no one had realized it. As one officer put it in a memo decades later, the Aleutians weren't just rocks. They were the line between fear and freedom. The fog that had once hidden the enemy had hidden their importance, too. But with every page unsealed, every report reread, the outline of history changed, and those men, lost for so long in the mist, finally began to reappear. And somewhere, in the wind that never stops blowing across those islands, it still sounds as if they're marching, steady, quiet, invisible. Every year, the fog still rolls in, and someone always leaves a cross on At-2. It's almost impossible to get there now. The island has no permanent residents, only wind and memories. The once busy airstrips are broken by grass. The bunkers rust into the tundra. When the fog lifts, you can see the bones of war scattered across the hills, a rusted helmet, a twisted propeller, a forgotten trench that now fills with wildflowers every summer. The Aleutians are silent, but they're not empty. They remember. In 2017, 74 years after the battle, a group of Americans and Japanese arrived together on a gray morning. Veterans, historians, diplomats, and a priest from each country. The boat couldn't land for hours because the waves were too strong, so they stood on deck in heavy coats, watching the mist close around them like a curtain. When they finally stepped ashore, the silence was so thick it felt like stepping into a photograph. One of the American veterans, nearly 90, leaned on his cane and said, "The wind still sounds the same." He was right. It howled through the hills exactly as it had in 1943, the same low voice that once drowned out gunfire. The ceremony was small, just a few dozen people gathered beside a monument of black stone. The inscription was simple: "To those who gave their lives on both sides of the battle for At-2." As the service began, the Japanese priest read a short prayer. His voice was almost lost in the wind. Then the American chaplain spoke. "May this ground, once torn by war, now hold peace." Afterward, the old veteran and a young Japanese historian stayed behind. They stood together at the edge of a ridge overlooking the sea, where the fog curled over the cliffs like breath. Between them, they placed a small wooden cross carved from driftwood. The veteran said, "We both lost men here." The historian nodded. "But maybe we both found something too." They didn't say what that something was. Maybe understanding. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe just the knowledge that even the coldest places on earth can hold warmth if someone remembers. The church they spoke of, the last church in the fog, locals call it, isn't really a church anymore. Just the frame of a building made from the wings of 2 wrecked aircraft, built by American engineers after the war to honor the fallen. For decades, the storms tore at it, but the structure still stands, stubborn, skeletal, and defiant against the wind. Inside, there are no flags, no altars. Only a cross welded from fragments of shell casings and a single inscription burned into wood. Peace built from ruins. Every few years, visitors come to repaint the words before they fade. They say that, When the fog drifts through the windows, the place hums, as if the island itself is breathing. The Aleutians were once the edge of war. Now they are the edge of memory. A new generation of historians calls the Aleutian Campaign the most forgotten front of the Second World War. But that's beginning to change. In recent years, classrooms have started teaching it again. Museums display artifacts recovered from the volcanic soil, a canteen, a rosary, a pair of frozen boots. The labels beneath them read, At-2, 1943, where war touched America. It took 70 years for the country to realize what those soldiers had done, how they had fought not for glory, but for ground that most Americans would never see. One Japanese archivist later said, "Both nations tried to conquer the fog. Neither could. They only passed through it." And maybe that's the truth. The fog, the cold, the distance, the silence, became the only victor, keeping the secrets until the world was ready to hear them. Today, the fog still drifts across At-2's mountains like a shroud. The wind still carries the sound of waves slapping against old landing barges. And sometimes, if you listen long enough, you can almost hear voices, not of battle, but of men talking softly, the way they did after the fighting stopped. They say that freedom is loud, that it comes with fireworks and cheers. But on these islands, it sounds different. It sounds like wind through grass, like a cross settling into soft earth, like a song carried on the sea between two nations that finally learned to bow, not to conquer, but to remember. The Aleutians taught America something that no victory parade ever could, that freedom isn't given. It's kept, guarded by those willing to stand in silence where the world ends and begins again. And when the fog rolls in, as it always does, it brings with it the echo of that first dawn in 1942, when war arrived on American soil, and the whisper of what came after. And that's how the war came home.